Overall, how would you assess the, I think I saw in your release, but maybe you could summarize kind of where you think the health of the bee populations are then right
Well, I think the honeybee populations are fine. There are, some threats, but those threats are all the way across the board for not just honeybees, but for all our other pollinators. We have not had any reported bee kills from pesticide use in a number of years. In fact, the last one that we got asked to get involved in turned out to actually be another beekeeper. The person came into an area, set their hives down. Apparently, this other beekeeper thought he was encroaching on their territory and went in and killed the other bees. So that's kind of.
What are all those other threats that,
As far
are
as,
kind of universal to all pollinators?
well, climate change is a big one for a number of the pollinators. The bumblebees, that appears to be one of the things that's happening. Destruction of habitat. We just don't have the flowering plants. People tend to keep their weeds down and everything like that. So there isn't the nectar sources and the pollen sources for pollinators. In other parts of the country, they do put together pollinator plans, and they do work with their highway departments and stuff to try and, like where they're mowing stuff all the time and everything, to try and provide better habitat that way. Unfortunately, around here with our water situation and our normal rainfall, that's probably an impossibility. Honestly, the biggest issue for the honeybees is probably their own management. It's really, most of these beekeepers that are suffering the big losses, and we really only have one or two, maybe three commercial beekeepers that are either located in the state or come into the state. We have a number of people that have 100 or less colonies, but when I talk about commercial ones, I'm talking about guys with thousands of colonies. And one of the problems that came out with colony collapse, again, was honeybees tend to be sedentary. Their colony tends to be there at least for a year. And they may move around a little bit in the spring, but they tend to be in one spot. These commercial, large commercial migratory beekeepers will go from Florida to Texas to California to Montana to South Dakota, and they'll constantly be being moved around following the flower sources, the nectar sources, and or for pollination services, which is a big deal, of course, especially with the almonds. They pay somewhere between $150 and $200 a hive to have hives brought into almonds. So that's a big deal for the beekeepers. So these bees wake up in the morning and they could be 2,000 miles or 1,000 miles away from where they were the day before, and it's just not easy on them. Another problem is these bees are being put, and not as much with our bees here, but they tend to be put on monocultures. And honeybees would much rather, and most bees would much rather have a diversity of pollen sources and nectar sources. And therefore they're healthier with that kind of situation. Okay. Another thing that seems to be a problem for the bees, gets back to bee health. These beekeepers, when they feed them, a lot of times they feed them, instead of leaving enough honey for the bees to survive the winter on, they feed them things like Karo syrup and alternate sugar sources, and they just don't do as well on it. So, but as far as, and I don't see our regulations, we have regulations on honeybee protection, that if you're a licensed applicator and you're applying to an agricultural crop, you have to pesticide to an agricultural crop. And if you've been notified by the beekeeper that he has bees in that area, then you have to notify them within 24 or 48 hours. It depends. There's some weird things in the law that we're probably going to change. But like I said, we haven't seen any kind of real issues. At least they've never been reported to us as far as issues with bee kills from
Well,
that.
the county keeps that list, you know, where you can, a beekeeper can, you know, the location of his hives is noted and his existence is noted.
Okay.
He gets notification. But what does the beekeeper do when he gets that notification?
Well, you know, they're supposed to, if they're given enough time, there's different things. It all depends on what pesticides are being applied and how they're being applied, what action. They may want to actually move the hive for several days. It used to be with a number of them, if you covered the hives and kept the hives cool, you could keep the bees inside from foraging. So there's a number of things that they can do. Moving them is probably the best bet. Again, it's really tough. Our regulations are really written primarily for licensed applicators, the agricultural situation, and commercial or semi-commercial beekeepers, okay? These guys with a lot more colonies. It's about, I don't know, the guy that has one in his backyard, a colony in his backyard, and if they're gonna spray nearby, the county's gonna spray, then, you know, moving it to somewhere else for a little while is the best bet. But that's a hard thing, because again, it gets back to that fact that honeybees forage for up to 2 miles. And are you gonna require a pest control company to notify everybody that has 1 or 2 hives within a 2-mile radius around the house they're spraying? That's a real tough situation.
Well, they say they would, they'd leave a buffer zone or something like that, but
Yeah.
you're talking about a 2-mile buffer zone, that's not gonna be effective.
Well, and then when you're talking about it's for West Nile virus, that's with a public health issue, it's a whole different thing. Most of these things, if you leave just a buffer, as long as you're not spraying directly on the colony, you're probably going to be okay. Again, it depends on the insecticide that they're using and how long that insecticide lasts in the environment. A number of the ones they use in alfalfa for a long time, they actually sprayed it at night, and by early morning the pesticide was gone and the bees could come back in. Unfortunately, that one was a really, really hot pesticide as far as human toxicity and everything else.
How toxic is pyrethrin to honeybees?
Well, it would, if they came in direct contact or were sprayed, it would be toxic. However, pyrethrum, these are, you'd have to check with Chuck Moses a little bit on that. You know, some of them don't last very long in the environment, so if they sprayed and they had several hours, it may be, or a day, it may be gone to the point. A lot of this stuff has to be kind of a direct contact type of deal for toxicity. So, again, a lot of variables there as far as, you know, what you're using, and I don't know what product, there's a lot of pyrethrins out there, so it depends on what product they were using.
Yeah, they say they're using that pyrethrin and there was a synthetic or.
It's a synthetic
It's a
pyrethrin,
synthetic.
yeah.
Yeah, pyrethrin.
Pyrethrum is actually or if you want to call it organic, it's derived from a plant that's a natural occurring pesticide. And most everything everybody uses is this synthetic stuff now.
Can you explain why Africanized bees have not moved further north into Nevada? You say they're like the Clark County line.
They're like the Clark County line. Well, the Africanized bee is a tropical bee. Okay, it's a tropical subspecies, and therefore it's been moving north. It was brought into Brazil. I can't remember the actual dates, but it's basically now extended in both directions and up into the mountains to where it can, as far as without hybridizing. And I'm sure hybridizing is occurring, and there's evidence of it in South America that they keep moving further and further up in the Andes. Right now, the traps that we run, basically, like I said, it's about the northern Clark County border is a rough, maybe a little bit up into Beatty, if you know where Beatty is, and a little
Yeah,
bit up
sure.
into Hyco and Caliente. We've trapped them up there, so.
And don't they do the same thing as honeybees as far
Yeah.
as pollination? It's just that their aggressive nature is why.
They are a honeybee. They are the same species of honeybee. It's just one's a different subspecies. They interbreed. The only way to tell them apart is either with PCR, DNA, or there's some wing measurements you can use to tell them apart. We can do quick and dirty identifications that way, so to speak.
But it's just that their aggressiveness is why.
Yeah, and actually some people feel they're actually better pollinators, and they're aggressive is one of the biggest problem. They're also a much tougher bee to manage because they like to, what they call it, scown. And they'll just, our European bee that's up here, you'll see swarming early in the year, April, May, a little bit into June maybe. Africanized bees swarm all year round. So that they're a bee that really moves around a lot. And so they're much harder to manage as far as, dealing with. They're harder to work because they're aggressive. I know one of the beekeepers that's down there in Vegas. Normal beekeepers, I think requeening occurs every 2 to 4 years. You actually put a new queen in the colony, and whether the old queen is still there or not, you take her out because she's not producing eggs like she should. Down there, to keep a colony European or keep it non-Africanized, you have to requeen every year. So there's some real issues with, and we've had several stinging incidences. I don't know if you guys, there was one just this last week when we were down in Vegas.
Sure. Throwing rocks.
They were throwing rocks at, the guys were throwing rocks and put at least one guy in the hospital and several to the hospital.
Were they Africanized?
Oh, yeah. Anything, we consider, from our standpoint, anything that's south of that northern Clark County line, if it's what we call a feral or non-managed colony, we consider it Africanized.
And you mentioned, people having more hives than ever before. It's not a hobby I'm familiar with. What sort of promoting that? Is there just more people interested in agriculture, gardening, or alternative?
A big part of it that's promoting it is people listening and hearing that the honeybees are dying off and they want to have honeybees. And like I said, up here, not as big a deal because if they don't do anything with their colony and they let it go, it's eventually just going to die off in the winter. Down south, they let it go and it's going to become Africanized. And we've had several cases where people not managing their colonies, there was a stinging incident in Pahrump a couple years ago, I think now, that the kid that was keeping the bees wasn't doing enough management practices and keeping them European, and something set them off, and you never know what's going to set Africanized bees off, and they stung, and to the point that one horse had to be put down, but they stung the horses. We've had no deaths from Africanized bees in Nevada. We've had 1 or 2 really serious stinging incidences. And that's something else. I mean, it all depends. Bee stings are all a matter of allergies and things like that. And gets back to when these people put a colony in their backyard, all of a sudden, most of the time the calls I get are because my wife's allergic or my kid's allergic. What can I do about it? Unfortunately, not much we can do at the state level. It's just a matter of going and talking to the people. And, there is people like to have, I guess, their homemade honey, I guess, if you want to call it that. You know, so there's a little bit of that causing this too, but a lot of it's been, they feel like that's going to help save the honeybees. And honestly, in Nevada, I don't think they need saving. I think our honeybee populations are fairly healthy, and you know, I haven't had lots of any reports of, you always get somebody that I got a colony that died, what happened to it. And we've looked into a couple of those things, but you know, colonies are honeybees are like any other insect. You take the Mormon crickets that we've had, you know, they were high for a few years and they dropped down. Now they may be coming up a little bit, but ups and downs. And honeybees have been through this before. I think it was in the 50s or 60s, at a meeting I was at last year, that they talked about the bee populations kind of semi-crashing or crashing, and then they come out of it.
And how important are the honeybees to Nevada agriculture, just, I mean, in general? Is it a vital part of what happens in Nevada with alfalfa and whatever crop?
Well, when you look at our crops, they're probably a pretty big part of any of the vegetable crops that we grow, and some of the fruits, but that's fairly small acreage. As far as alfalfa grown for hay is concerned, they don't play a part in it at all. As far as trying to think of any of our other crops, our potatoes, they don't play a part in potato production at all. Alfalfa grown for seed, which is way, way down as far as our levels go, they play a minor part. Like I said, most of that is done by either alfalfa leafcutter bees or what's called the alkali bee, which is a native bee that's actually managed for that purpose. So agriculture production in Nevada, you know, the other thing that people recently at our National Entomological Society meeting, I tried to go to as many of the lectures I could on honeybees, and a couple things that came out of it that are kind of interesting. One, they did some studies up in Washington, and they compared apple orchards without any honeybees in them and apple orchards that had honeybees in them. And there was actually no difference in production. All these things that are all of our native pollinators are actually very good pollinators. And so it becomes this idea that we're all going to starve to death. Now granted, the data's right. It's right that I can't even, somebody else has to remember the quote for me. Every third bite or something relies on honeybees or something. The beekeepers have all that down pat. But with all these other things that are wind pollinated and pollinated by other species of bees and stuff, and there's people that are working now to get us away from this monoculture type use, if you will, of honeybees as pollinators and using some of these other bees that are easier to manage. And they still have all their problems too. They still have diseases and parasites and all that kind of stuff, just like the honeybee does. But they're a little bit different management. What was the other thing? Oh, one of the other interesting talks was about this hobbyist beekeeper situation. One of the, I think she's the apiculture specialist for the University of Minnesota. I'd have to look at that, but I'm pretty sure it was from Minnesota. She was worried about, there's so many hobbyist beekeepers coming into the Twin Cities area that there's actually going to be competition between the hives for the resources. In other words, there's not enough resources in a city, in those cities, to support the number of bees that are coming into it, that people are bringing into it. So
Those large commercial hive operators then don't really have any business in Nevada as far as...
Well, they do. They come into, we have several of them that come into Nevada for alfalfa, but it's not so much alfalfa seed production as it is alfalfa hay, and the nectar from alfalfa makes apparently really good honey, and it's one of the more the more sought after honey, you get a better price for it.
So they do it for their own purposes
Yeah.
as opposed to doing it for the rancher or?
Right, for the most part, that's, in fact, the ranchers usually get, a box of honey at the end, that's what they get for it at the end of the season, so.
What effect is the drought having on
That's a really good question, and Bob and I kind of talked about that. It definitely has an effect from the management standpoint of honeybees need water. And if they don't have water nearby, they're gonna go find it. And if they have to spend a lot of energy finding water, that's gonna affect the health of the colony. Same with the fact that if we have less flowering plants for nectar and pollen sources, it's gonna stress the colonies again. So definitely a matter of, I don't know how, in the managed areas, in our agricultural production areas, probably there's gonna be plenty of water around, except maybe down toward the very end of the summer, things might start getting tight that way. But as far as these people that have 2 or 3 colonies of bees, or 10 colonies of bees, they definitely need to be thinking of providing them a water source this year, where everybody's cutting back on watering lawns, and irrigation is cut back now. There's going to be, they're going to have to find water somewhere.
There are some garden centers that sell the little packets of mason bees,
Right.
primarily. Is there any harm to that?
No, you can get your own mason bees going with these things up here, and that's really, I tend to recommend that, only because these mason bees, if they're local, it's great. If they're mason bees that are coming from Idaho, Utah, or somewhere else, you're probably gonna have to resupplement them all the time, because those bees aren't as resistant to the diseases that are here, that our mason bees that are here, same species of bee, but our bees here, just like anything, that they build up a resistance to those diseases. You bring a new one in, and they don't have any resistance to that disease, so they die off a lot of times. The only other thing we've seen with those, the consumer needs to be careful about what they buy from the standpoint of, if you look at this, they sell them in tubes and nest blocks and that kind of thing. Our recommendation is these holes need to be about 5 to 5.5 inches deep. So the reason for that is when you look at, I should throw that out there, but when you look at what is produced in one of these long, and the female builds a number of cells. She maybe has 10 cells in here that have bees in it. The bottom cells are all female, and the top cells will be all males. And she determines the sex of the egg by measuring the distance she's gone in. So if you get little short tubes with your bees that you're buying mostly males. They do you absolutely no good at all.
Yeah.
Typical males. They males go out and they take nectar, but they don't collect pollen. And so what you want is something that's longer, that produces a lot, that you're going to get a lot of females coming out. And they're used quite, mason bees and those other species of leafcutter bees. There's one that's used in blueberries very commonly. And they're getting more and more of them in commercial production situations. But they're nice to manage. You can actually, with alfalfa leafcutter bees, you actually can take the bee and time its emergence when it's going to come out to the flowering of the plant. And so you actually keep them cool to the right point where they're ready to where the plant's ready to have them pollinated. Honeybees aren't good pollinators of alfalfa because of the way the flower behaves or is triggered. It has this little trigger in it And when a honeybee sticks its head in an alfalfa flower, this little trigger whacks it between the eyes. And they don't like that. So they actually learn to go around the side of the flower and cut the flower open and take the nectar out. And then they don't pollinate the flower. So, but mason bees, you can buy bumblebees. Bumblebees are not cheap. They're a couple $100 for a colony. But you can purchase them. You know, I know there's at least, I know of one nursery that's selling mason bees, but you can order them online and stuff too. There's no regulations. I would just recommend to people to try and, you know, if you want mason bees and stuff, it's pretty easy to put these kind of blocks out and get them going. And once they get going, there's a few things you need to do to keep them going, but they're great pollinators. I stood in front of a leafcutter bee domiciles with thousands of bees flying around me and landing on me, and they don't sting. They're not aggressive like a honeybee is, because they're not protecting a colony so much. These guys are the individual. Every leafcutter bee takes care of her own nest. They like to be together. They're gregarious, but they're individual nesting.
Any more questions?
Do you have any counts on the people, you know, any estimate number-wise on how many people are, you know, establishing colonies or anything like that?
All I know is that the Northern Nevada Beekeepers Association used to meet in this room, and there used to be about 12 of them. There were very commonly kind of the main core, and I've been told they've moved out of this building because they can't, it's too small to have their meetings in this room. And this room will, it's easily quadrupled, I think, in number. As far as, and those are only the guys that are going to, and I do recommend that, if people are interested in getting into beekeeping, they really ought to come to the Northern Nevada Beekeepers Association meetings. And there's lots of people that'll help them and give them tips and get them on the right road, taking care of bees the way they're supposed to be taken care of. But we do, I'll throw, we do not register colonies in Nevada. A number of other states do. We got out of that business 10 or 15 years ago, at least, maybe 20 years ago now, simply because for what we would have to charge per colony, it became, you know, because with that, you know, we're thinking about kind of along the lines of this county thing. We're thinking about maybe a voluntary type of deal statewide for this sort of thing. I'll have to visit the county website. I've never gone and taken a look at it. They, where the people could say, I got 10 hives at such and such a location, and then it would maybe help things out. You know, trying to register colonies is just, it's A, a nightmare, and B, how do you check up on them? You got these guys that are bringing 100 colonies over from California, and it's just, for us, it was just too much work. Like I said, a lot of other states, I know Utah does. I looked at Maryland registers, a lot of other states register colonies. Well, we registered them back when there was before the mites came in. We were trying to keep the mites out, and we were trying to keep some of the other diseases out. And once they got established here, there really wasn't much reason for it. Okay? More questions? I can hang out here and talk bees and insects all afternoon. Bob knows.